Silence swallowed the underground poker room at 2:13 in the morning. The steel door groaned open, and a woman stumbled through it like something broken being discarded. Blood dripped from a gash above her right eye onto the green felt tables below. Nora Reynolds. 27 years old but looking decades older, her dark hair plastered to her pale face with melted snow and blood, a cheap nanny uniform torn at the collar. Purple-black handprint bruises spelled out 5 distinct fingers across her throat. Each one was a word. Each one was a name. Douglas Hale. The scent of cigar smoke and whiskey hit her as she staggered between tables where men in expensive suits froze mid-deal, cards suspended in air like they had forgotten how to move. Enzo and Gino rose from their positions at the back wall, hands drifting toward the weapons holstered beneath their jackets, but they stopped. They stopped because of the badge. The Emma Bianchi nanny badge, still clipped to her blood-stained coat. Behind them, Alejandro Bianchi rose from his seat at the private table. 6'3". Shoulders broad enough to carry empires. Black suit that cost more than everything she owned combined. Dark eyes that had watched men beg for mercy and given them none. His hand rested on the edge of the table, and the entire room understood that whatever was about to happen, it had already begun. The badge meant everything. The badge meant she was his. Nora collapsed against a poker table, her breathing ragged and fractured like shattered glass. "I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go. The storm, he found me, I couldn't let him." Her hand shook so violently that $34 in crumpled bills fell from her pocket onto the floor. $34. All she had left in the world after 3 years of rent and food and medicine for a child who wasn't hers. Alejandro moved forward. His men had worked for him for 15 years. 15 years of watching him negotiate with violence, of seeing him order disappearances with a single glance, of understanding that mercy was not a word in his vocabulary. But in that moment, as he walked toward the bleeding woman with the nanny badge, something shifted. Something they could not name. He knelt down. Not slowly. Not with hesitation. Simply knelt and picked up the $34 from the floor. "What is your name?" His voice was deep and solid like an oath. "Nora. Nora Reynolds." Barely a whisper. "And the child?" "Emma. Your daughter. I kept her safe. I kept her," her voice fractured. "I didn't steal from him. I swear I didn't steal anything. He said $125,000 and I don't have that, I don't have anything, and when I told him no, he took me into an alley and he..." Alejandro's jaw tightened. $125,000. A number someone had invented. A number that had no truth behind it. Just a weapon. Just a reason to hurt her. "How long?" he asked. 3 years. I have been with Emma for 3 years. "Not that." "How long has she called you Mama?" The silence that followed was complete. It filled the room like water filling a drowning man's lungs. Nora's eyes glistened with tears that had no permission to fall. "She doesn't," Nora whispered. "I am just the nanny. I sleep in a closet. I am nobody." Enzo looked at Gino. In 15 years, they had never seen Alejandro kneel for anyone. But what she did not know was that 3 years ago, Alejandro Bianchi had stood in a hospital corridor while his daughter, Emma, screamed in pain from separation anxiety as doctors tried to place and fall line. The nanny, this nanny, Nora Reynolds, had walked into that room, taken Emma's small hand, and sung to her. A simple song. A lullaby. And Emma had stopped screaming. He had watched from the doorway as his daughter, a child raised in darkness and violence, leaned her head against Nora's shoulder and found peace. And in that moment, something cold and dangerous stirred in his chest. A question he had never asked before. What if safety could exist? What if his daughter could know something other than fear? For 3 years, Nora had been the answer to that question. She had been invisible. A ghost in his daughter's life, faithful and quiet, sleeping in a converted closet while his wife, Victoria Ashford, treated her like furniture to be moved around when inconvenient. And now this woman stood before him, bleeding, broken, with the names of her attackers written in bruises across her skin. "You are not nobody," Alejandro said, and his voice carried the weight of something that could not be taken back. "The people who did this believed you were nobody. And that belief needs to be corrected." He stood. He turned to Enzo. "Find Douglas Hale. I want to know where he is, who he answers to, and why he thought he could touch what is mine. And the money he claims she stole." Enzo asked. "There is no money. There was never any money. There is only a man who used to lie as an excuse to break a woman who had no one to protect her." Alejandro looked back at Nora. Until now. The poker room remained silent except for one sound. The rain against the windows above them. Relentless. Cold. Striking the glass like it had a vendetta against the world. Gino moved forward with a towel from behind the bar. He approached Nora carefully, the way you would approach a wounded animal that might bolt at any moment. "Let me see," he said, his voice softer than it had any right to be given the size of his hands. She flinched at first, then allowed him to dab the blood from her eye. The gash was deep but clean. Nothing that would scar beyond what she already carried. "We have a doctor," Alejandro said. "He will meet us upstairs. He has treated worse than this. I don't have money to pay." "You do not pay. You are protected." The word protected hung in the air between them. 3 years she had worked in his household. 3 years of being invisible. And in one moment, one bleeding moment, everything had shifted. She was no longer invisible. She was noticed. She was claimed. She was protected. "Where is Victoria?" Nora asked. "Your wife, she doesn't know I'm here. She will be worried." Enzo and Gino exchanged the smallest glance. A glance that contained knowledge they would never speak aloud. Victoria Ashford had known exactly where Nora was going when she left the house. Victoria had mentioned it casually at dinner. Mentioned it to Douglas Hale, who had been invited to the evening, who had smiled and nodded and stored the information away like a weapon waiting to be used. But that was a truth for later. For now, there was only the rain, and the bleeding woman, and a man who had spent 3 years waiting for a reason to act. "Emma is asleep upstairs," Alejandro said. "She sleeps better when you are near. This has been true since the day you arrived. My wife does not understand this. I do." He extended his hand. "Will you come?" Nora looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She looked at the men in expensive suits who had frozen mid-deal and were now watching her like she had become the most important thing in the room. She took his hand. "Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Now let us go back to the beginning to understand how a nanny who sleeps in a converted closet ended up bleeding in the most dangerous room in Boston." The clock in Victoria Ashford's mansion read 11:47 when the first crack appeared in Nora Reynolds' carefully constructed silence. She had been awake for 16 hours. Her feet ached in a way that suggested they might never stop aching, like her body had decided that pain was simply the permanent cost of breathing. The children's bedtime routine had stretched past 10 o'clock, Emma refusing to sleep without 3 stories, Michael demanding his favorite pajamas be washed immediately, and Victoria's voice cutting through the hallway at regular intervals with demands that were less requests and more small cruelties designed to test whether Nora still had any dignity left to break. Nora's bedroom was not a bedroom. It was a converted closet on the 3rd floor, 6 feet by 8 feet, with a twin mattress on the floor and a single pipe running along the ceiling that served as her closet rod. The walls were painted institutional gray. There were no windows. The air felt recycled, as if it had already been breathed by everyone else in the house before reaching her lungs. Her grandmother's recipe book sat on the floor beside her mattress, its spine cracked from 100 readings, its margins filled with handwritten notes in fading blue ink. Measurements converted. Ingredients substituted. Survival recipes for women who had to feed families on nothing. It was the only beautiful thing she owned. At midnight, Victoria's voice sliced through the door. Nora. The children need you. Now. Nora's eyes opened. She had not been sleeping. She rarely slept anymore. Her body had learned to exist in a state of constant readiness, like a hunted animal that never fully released its vigilance. She pulled on her cardigan, the only sweater she owned that didn't have holes in the elbows, and made her way down the hallway. The marble floors were cold under her bare feet. The Ashford mansion on Beacon Hill was always cold, despite the expensive heating system and the fireplaces that never seemed to actually warm anything. Cold marble. Cold crystal chandeliers catching the light like frozen tears. Cold silk curtains that cost more than Nora's annual salary. Victoria stood in the kitchen wearing designer pajamas, the kind that cost $300 and were somehow more fashionable than actual clothes. Her blonde hair was perfect. Her face showed no sign of having been asleep. She pointed one manicured finger at the granite counter. There, Victoria said. A single water glass sat beside the sink. One of the children left this out, Victoria continued, her voice carrying the precise tone of someone explaining a fundamental failure in the universe. The children. Who you are being paid to manage. Who apparently have learned nothing about responsibility. Nora said nothing. Words were dangerous in this house. Words could be twisted, reported, used as evidence of an ungrateful attitude. Nora had learned this lesson slowly, over 3 years, through 1,000 small corrections. I don't understand how you let these things happen, Victoria said. Do you know what people say about households like this? They say the help doesn't care. They say she's lazy. She's incompetent. She's lucky I let her live here at all. Most girls like you would be on the streets. Most girls like you. As if Nora were a category. As if poverty were a smell that marked you permanently, no matter how much soap you used. Victoria turned away, her silk pajamas whispering as she moved. She didn't wait for a response. She simply assumed her words would be obeyed, as she assumed all things, that the universe bent toward her preferences, that people existed to solve her problems, that compassion was a luxury item only available to the wealthy. Nora picked up the glass. She washed it. She dried it. She placed it in the cabinet where glasses belonged. She returned to her closet at 12:23 in the morning and lay on her mattress and stared at the ceiling. The phone buzzed at 12:31. Unknown number. The message came through in all capitals, the words packed with the desperation of someone who believed volume could compensate for sense. I know you're there. I'm coming for my money. You can't hide from me. Douglas Hale. She had never borrowed money from Douglas Hale. She had never even spoken to Douglas Hale. But Victoria had mentioned him at dinner 3 days ago, had casually asked Nora to refill his wine glass, had smiled in a way that suggested she was planting something. A seed. A time bomb. A loaded gun waiting for the right moment to discharge. The phone buzzed again. And again. And again. Messages arriving like waves, each one identical, each one more frantic than the last. She blocked the number. The messages continued from a different number. Then another. Then 5 more. I know where you work. I know where you sleep. You stole from me and you're going to pay it back. Every penny. Or someone else is going to pay for it. $125,000. The number made no sense. Nora had never seen $125,000. She had $43 to her name. $43, 3 days until payday, and $7 left to spend on food for those 3 days. She had mastered the mathematics of survival so thoroughly that the number $125,000 felt like something from another language entirely. The number belonged to other people. Richer people. People who did not count each penny like it was the difference between eating and starving. She heard the engine before she saw the headlights. A car pulled up outside the mansion, idling on Beacon Hill in the darkness. The November wind howled through the streets with the sound of something alive, something hungry, something that wanted to consume everything warm and leave only ice. Nora moved to the tiny window at the top of her closet bedroom, the window that was mostly blocked by the mansion's exterior wall. She could see headlights cutting through the darkness. She could see them waiting. Something inside her broke open. Not dramatically. Not with a sound. But like a dam finally surrendering to the pressure it had been resisting for 3 years. She couldn't stay here. If she stayed, Douglas would come inside. He would find her in this converted closet, this 6x8 prison-painted institutional grey. He would do what men like him always did when they believed they had rights to women like her. She grabbed her coat. She grabbed the recipe book. She grabbed the $34 from the coffee can hidden behind the radiator, every penny she had managed to save, every dollar extracted from her wages, every small victory against poverty now gathered into her trembling hand. $34. It would have to be enough. The service entrance was at the back of the mansion, a narrow door used by the gardener and the delivery people, forgotten by the Ashfords because they never entered through it themselves. The November wind hit her like a blade wrapped in ice the moment she stepped outside. Snow was already falling thick and heavy, 6 inches accumulated on the ground, the sky the color of bruised flesh. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. The wind cut through her coat as if the fabric was nothing but air. She ran toward the street, toward the main road where taxis sometimes passed, toward anything that wasn't here, wasn't the mansion, wasn't the man waiting in the car on Beacon Hill. She ran into the blizzard, her breath freezing in her lungs, her feet slipping on the ice-covered sidewalk, her mind cataloguing the one place where she might find safety. The women's shelter on Amsterdam Street. She volunteered there twice a week, helping serve meals to women who had nowhere else to go. They would let her stay. They had to. Nowhere else remained. What she did not know, what she had no way of knowing as she stumbled through the midnight streets with snow accumulating in her hair and her hands numb and her heart pounding like something trying to escape from her body, was that Douglas Hale had been watching the shelter for 3 nights straight. He had borrowed money from people who lent at rates that required payment in more than dollars. He had invested in a scheme that collapsed like wet paper. And he had decided, in the way that certain men decide, that someone else would bear the cost of his failure. He had been watching the shelter, waiting for her, knowing that when desperation came calling, she would run toward the only place that had ever shown her kindness. The snow fell heavier. The wind screamed. And Nora Reynolds ran toward a night that would change everything, still believing she was the only one hunting. Still unaware that she herself had become the prey. The alley behind the women's shelter on Amsterdam Street was narrow and dark, the kind of place where the city's forgotten corners collected refuse and secrets. Snow fell in thick sheets, accumulating on the fire escapes above, muffling sound until the world felt suspended in white silence. Nora had been inside the shelter for 52 minutes, her hands gradually thawing under the warm water of the industrial sink as she helped sort donated clothing. Her face was still numb from the wind. Her lungs still burned from running. Maria, the shelter director, had asked if she was all right. Nora had lied. Just cold, she'd said. Just tired. She'd volunteered here twice a week for 2 years, showing up even when her body screamed for rest, even when she had no money for food, because helping others made her feel less like nobody. Made her feel like her suffering meant something. At 1:52 in the morning, she stepped through the back door into the alley. Douglas Hale emerged from the shadows like something sewn together from rage and entitlement. Mid-30s, muscular in the way men become muscular when they spend hours at gyms instead of working, his expensive black coat hanging open over a designer shirt that probably cost more than Nora's monthly rent. His face was the color of infected flesh, his eyes the dead eyes of a man who'd been drinking for hours, fueling a grievance that had metastasized into something violent. "Where is it?" His voice came out like glass breaking underwater. "Where's my $125,000, Nora?" She stepped backward, her boot heel catching on a crack in the concrete. "Douglas, I don't know what you're talking about. There was never any money. You broke up with me 8 months ago. I filed 6 police reports. 6. Every single one disappeared because you drink with half the Boston Police Department, and they protect their own. He moved faster than she expected. His hand closed around her throat like a vice, tightening, slamming her backward against the brick wall with enough force to knock the air from her lungs. Her head struck stone and stars exploded across her vision. The smell of whiskey and cologne choked her. "You think you can steal from me and play saint in shelters?" His breath came hot and rancid against her face. "You think volunteering here makes you clean? It doesn't. It makes you a thief playing dress up." She clawed at his wrist, her fingernails digging for flesh, for any purchase that might break his grip. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel with his face at the center. Purple dots bloomed at the edges of her sight. "I can't," she gasped. "I never took anything. Please." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass, like the destruction of something fragile and irreplaceable. "Then you'll work it off. You'll come with me right now, or I'll make sure everyone in this city knows what you really are. A thief. A liar. And they'll believe me." She drove her knee upward, connecting with the soft junction of his thighs. He released her throat with a grunt of pain, and she ran. But he was faster. His hand seized her hair at the base of her skull, yanking her backward so hard she felt something tear. The world inverted. Her body slammed face first into the metal dumpster beside the shelter's entrance. The impact opened the skin above her right eye. Blood flooded down her face, warm and metallic, filling her vision. She tasted it on her tongue. He pressed her against the dumpster, one forearm across her shoulders, pinning her. His free hand wrapped around her throat again, squeezing. Not a grip meant to frighten. A grip meant to end. The world began folding inward, grey at first, then darker. Her lungs burned for air that wouldn't come. Her fingers scrabbled against his arm, his neck, finding nothing that would break his hold. This was how it ended, she thought. Bleeding in an alley, killed by a man she'd dated for 7 months, killed because she'd said no, because she'd refused to let him control her. In a few seconds, it would be over. Then a sound cut through the roaring in her ears. A child crying from inside the shelter. Footsteps. Someone coming. A voice calling out. The distraction lasted only a second, Douglas's attention flickering toward the door, but it was the only second she needed. She drove her elbow backward with everything her body had left, connecting with his ribs hard enough that he wheezed. His grip loosened. She twisted free and ran. Blood streamed into her eye. Her breath came in gasps that felt like inhaling broken glass. Behind her, she heard him cursing, heard his footsteps, but the blizzard had intensified, snow falling so thick now that visibility dropped to 10 feet. She ran without direction, without destination, just away, 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 her feet slipping on ice, her mind fragmenting. The police would not help her. Douglas had made sure of that. The shelter couldn't harbor her, not when his cop friends would come looking. She had $34 in her wallet. She had a storage unit in Dorchester containing her grandmother's recipe book, the only thing in the world that mattered, and some boxes of her dead mother's belongings. She had nothing else. As she ran through the white darkness, bleeding and half-blind, one thought surfaced through the panic: the underground poker room on Atlantic Avenue. The place where dangerous men conducted their business behind closed doors. She'd heard the other waitresses at the diner talk about it in whispers. A place where people knew not to ask questions. Where someone bleeding in the darkness might find shelter, at least for a few hours. She changed direction, toward the water, toward the underground. At 2:13 in the morning, Nora Reynolds collapsed through the back entrance of the poker room, her neck marked with fingerprints that spelled out Douglas Hale's name in black and purple bruises, her right eye swollen shut, blood drying on her shirt. The room went silent. 37 men in expensive suits stopped moving. Enzo, who managed security for Alindro Bianchi's operation, stepped forward immediately. But before he could speak, a voice came from the back corner. "That's Emma's Nora." The man who said it was tall, perhaps 6'2", with the kind of presence that made other men smaller by proximity. His suit was charcoal wool tailored to his broad shoulders, the white shirt beneath unbuttoned at the collar showing a chest marked with a scar that ran from collarbone to sternum like a map of violence survived. His hair was dark, silvered at the temples. His eyes were storm gray, the color of sky before lightning strikes. This was Alejandro Bianchi, who had built an empire that stretched across Boston and into New York, who made decisions that erased people from existence, who was feared by every law enforcement officer in the state. And he was looking at Nora Reynolds like she was someone who mattered. Nora struggled to focus, her left eye open just a sliver, her right eye useless. Emma. Her voice came out shattered, barely a whisper. I don't understand. Alejandro stood and moved toward her with the deliberate pace of a man accustomed to having all the time he needed. Sit, he said. It wasn't a request. Her legs gave out before he finished speaking. She sat in the nearest chair, and Enzo appeared instantly with a first aid kit, beginning to clean the blood from her face with surprising gentleness. Water turned red in the bowl. The cut above her eye was deep, ragged, the kind of wound that would scar. Alejandro pulled up a chair and sat across from her, less than 3 feet away. In 15 years, none of his men had ever seen him sit this close to someone in distress. Gino whispered to Marco, "Something is wrong. Boss doesn't do this." Marco shook his head, unable to explain what they were witnessing. 3 years ago, Alejandro said, his voice low and steady like an incantation, "My daughter Emma was placed into temporary foster care during a custody dispute. The state wouldn't tell me which family. I've had investigators searching ever since. You raised her for 8 months before I got her back. You read her stories. You held her when she cried. You made her feel safe." Nora's face crumbled. The tears came suddenly, violently, the kind of crying that comes from being unseen for so long that recognition breaks something open inside you. "The girl with the brown curls," she whispered. "The one who was afraid of loud noises? That was Emma. That was Emma. She's 7 now. She's safe. She talks about Nora every single day. She asks when you're coming back to read her stories. Because of you, she learned that the world contains kindness. That's not a small thing, Nora Reynolds. That's everything." She couldn't speak. The words dissolved in her throat. She'd spent 3 years in Victoria Ashford's mansion, living in a converted closet, earning $2,100 a month for 14-hour days, pouring every cent into a storage unit because she had nowhere else to keep her grandmother's recipe book with her notes in the margins, the only piece of her family left. Victoria had treated her like furniture. The children had called her by her first name but never thanked her. No one had ever acknowledged what she did, the invisible labor of caring. And then Emma had been taken away as suddenly as she'd arrived. Nora had grieved alone. "Start from the beginning," Alejandro said. "Tell me everything." She did. The words came out disjointed at first, then faster, then in a rush that couldn't be stopped. She told him about working for the Ashford family, about sleeping in a closet barely large enough to turn around in, about Victoria's voice, "You're not family, Nora, you're staff. Don't forget that." She told him about the exact moment Victoria had said, "Your opinion on the children's education doesn't matter. You're just the help." Enzo's jaw clenched. Gino muttered something in Italian that sounded like cursing. She told him about Douglas Hale. 7 months of dating. 7 months that felt normal until suddenly it wasn't. The tracking app on her phone. The accusations that spiraled into paranoia. The first time he hit her was 4 months in. She'd broken up with him immediately, but he wouldn't accept it. He showed up at the diner where she worked 3 nights a week, demanding to know who she was talking to, accusing her of cheating, stealing, lying. The police reports she filed that went nowhere because Douglas spent Thursday nights drinking with half the Boston Police Department, and cops protect their own. Tonight was the worst yet. "He says I stole $125,000 from him," she whispered. "I have no idea where that number came from. I have $34. That's all I own in the world besides my grandmother's recipe book and my mother's things in storage. I don't have 125,000 cents. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Alejandro's expression didn't change, but the men around him went very still, the way animals go still when a predator enters the room. "Why would you help me?" Nora asked. Her voice trembled like a candle in the wind. "I'm nobody. I'm a nanny who sleeps in a closet. You run all of this." She gestured at the poker room, the armed men, the stacks of cash sitting on tables like trophies. "You're Alejandro Bianchi. Why would you risk anything for someone like me?" He leaned forward, and his eyes held hers for a long moment before he spoke. "My father used to beat me unconscious for bringing home bad grades," he said quietly. "I grew up in a basement in South Boston with nothing, eating food from dumpsters, stealing to survive. Rats the size of my hands. Darkness so complete I forgot what sunlight looked like. When I got out, I swore that no child would ever suffer the way I did. Emma told me about you. The woman who held her when she cried. Who taught her that people can be kind. You protected her when I couldn't." He paused. "That makes you someone." Behind him, Enzo whispered to Gino, "Boss is serious." Gino nodded slowly, understanding that something had shifted in the world, that the man who killed without hesitation, who erased people from existence without a second thought, was now facing someone he would move mountains for. Outside, the blizzard had intensified into something biblical. Snow accumulated in drifts against the windows. The wind screamed like something dying. The streets of Boston were sealed, impassable, the whole city reduced to white silence. "You'll stay here tonight," Alejandro said. "The storm's too dangerous. Tomorrow we handle this properly." Nora started to protest, but he held up one hand and she fell silent. "Douglas Hale came after someone under my protection. Someone who raised my daughter with more kindness than she'd ever known. He doesn't get to walk away from that. Do you understand?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. What none of them knew was that Douglas had already sent Victoria Ashford a message while Nora was inside the shelter. A message with a photo and an address. A message that said, "I left her bleeding in the alley. She's probably dead by now. Either way, she won't bother us anymore." And Victoria Ashford, reading that message in her mansion on Beacon Hill, was already planning something worse than anything Douglas had done. Because Victoria understood something that men like Douglas never would, that destruction doesn't require violence. It requires patience. It requires public humiliation. It requires erasing someone so completely that the world forgets they ever existed at all. The storm howled against the windows. Nora sat in the underground poker room, bleeding and terrified, finally safe but unaware that her real danger was only beginning. The frozen bench in Boston Common bit through her borrowed coat at 10:53 in the morning. Nora Reynolds sat motionless, snow accumulating on her shoulders like a burial shroud, her grandmother's recipe book trembling in hands that could not stop shaking. The bruises on her throat had deepened to purple-black, each one shaped like Douglas Hale's fingers, a map of violence written across her skin. Her breath came in shallow clouds, visible and fragile in the bitter air. She had $34 in her pocket. Nothing else. No home waiting. No job after she'd abandoned the Ashford mansion without explanation. No police who would listen. No family. No future that didn't involve running until her body finally gave out. The voices in her head sounded like other people's cruelty. Victoria Ashford's dismissive tone, "You're nobody, Nora. Just a girl who sleeps in closets and eats scraps." Douglas's snarl, "You can't hide from me. Not forever. Not from men who have money and connections." She looked at the frozen pond 3 blocks away, a sheet of white ice that stretched toward nothing. It would be simple. Just walk out. Let the cold take her. Stop fighting a battle against enemies too powerful, too connected, too ruthless. Her hand moved to her coat pocket. But her fingers found the recipe book instead. She pulled it out, snow melting on its water-stained cover. The pages were falling apart, held together by love and tape, filled with her grandmother's handwriting in the margins. Measurements crossed out and rewritten. Notes in cursive that shook with age. And on the inside front cover, written the week before her grandmother died, 5 words in permanent ink: "The storm will pass and you are far stronger than you think." Nora read them 3 times. Her hand still shook. Her body still ached. Her future still looked impossible. But something shifted in her chest. Something cold and dangerous. Not hope. Not yet. Just the smallest seed of refusal. She would not die on this bench. She would not let Douglas win. She would not let Victoria erase her. She stood up. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in the Ashford mansion on Beacon Hill, Douglas Hale and Victoria Ashford were finalizing their plan. Douglas sat in Victoria's white marble kitchen, phone in hand, face flushed with confidence. Victoria paced the floor in her tailored Chanel suit, her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of disdain. She had spent 47 years building a reputation in Boston society. She would not let a peasant girl destroy it. The police? Victoria asked. 3 of my guys, Douglas said. I told them she stole a diamond necklace. Worth $125,000. They'll arrest her before lunch. Victoria nodded, already rehearsing her statement in her head. The girl became unhinged after we let her go. She fabricated these accusations to create a distraction. We're pressing charges. We're cooperating fully with authorities. By evening, Nora Reynolds would be sitting in a cell. By next week, she would be forgotten. Douglas checked his watch. 10:52 a.m. The execution was scheduled for noon. Perfect timing. What neither of them realized was that Alindro Bianchi's investigator had been watching Douglas Hale for the past 6 hours. Every phone call recorded. Every movement tracked. The moment Alindro's phone rang at 8:15 a.m. with the news that Douglas and Victoria were planning to move at noon, the moment Alindro learned that Nora had slipped out of the poker den at 10:04 a.m. despite his instructions, something shifted in his face that made even Enzo take a step back. Find her, he said. 1 sentence. Absolute command. At 10:08 a.m., Alindro's people located Nora sitting on the frozen bench in Boston Common, snow on her shoulders, her grandmother's recipe book in her hands. They brought her back to the penthouse at the top of his building, 32 stories above the city. Warm. Safe. Wrapped in blankets while outside the windows, Boston sprawled below like a toy city. Nora didn't know where she was at first. She woke to softness, to heat, to the smell of coffee and clean linens. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. Then she saw Enzo standing in the doorway of the bedroom, and reality crashed back. Where she started, but her voice was broken from the bruises, barely a whisper. Boss had you brought in an hour ago, Enzo said. His voice was quiet, respectful. Not the voice of someone speaking to a nobody. You need to rest. Everything is being handled. At 11:02 a.m., Douglas Hale pulled his car up to the Ashford mansion, expecting to coordinate a destruction. Victoria was already waiting, dressed in white like innocence itself. They walked through the front door at 11:09 a.m. That's when Douglas saw them. 12 men in black surrounded the mansion like a noose. Not police. Worse. Alindro Bianchi's crew, standing with a kind of stillness that comes from years of violence. Moving like ghosts. Moving like certainty. Douglas's face drained of color so completely he looked like a corpse still wearing a suit. No, he whispered. He tried to run for the back door. Gino was already there, 6'3", built like a hammer, blocking the path with his arms crossed. Douglas reversed direction, looking for a window, for anything. But the men were closing in, patient and relentless. Victoria stood frozen, her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looking like a mask. At 11:12 a.m., Alindro walked through the front door. Not rushing. Not angry. Just present, the way a storm is present before it destroys everything. Enzo and 4 others flanked him, creating a wall of tailored suits and cold eyes. Douglas backed against the wall, his hands rising in a gesture of surrender that came too late. "I don't know what you think this is," he said, his voice cracking, "but you're making a mistake." Alejandro's voice was glacier cold, every word precisely placed. "You put your hands on someone under my protection. You threatened her. You demanded $125,000 that never existed." "She stole," Douglas said. "She stole from the Ashfords. I was just helping them recover." "She has $34 to her name," Alejandro cut him off. "You're a liar and a coward who beats women because you're weak. Because violence is the only language you understand." Douglas dropped to his knees, trembling like a cornered animal, his body folding in on itself. "Please. Please, I'll disappear. I'll leave her alone. Just let me go. I'm begging you." "Too late," Alejandro said. He nodded once. Enzo moved forward with the kind of efficiency that came from practice. Douglas screamed as they dragged him toward the black SUV waiting outside, his voice echoing through the mansion, mixing with the sound of footsteps on marble tile. His screams faded as the door closed behind them. Silence rushed back in like a wound sealing shut. Victoria watched this, her composure shattering like ice in spring. She pulled herself together, straightening her suit. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, and her voice was sharp again, grasping for power. "My family has connections. Lawyers. You can't just walk into my home." Alejandro turned to her slowly. "You paid Nora Reynolds $2,100 a month for 14-hour days. You made her sleep in a closet. You told her she was worthless. You told her she was nobody." Victoria's face hardened. "She was just a nanny. Everyone treats help that way. That's normal." "I have recordings," Alejandro said. "Every conversation. Your tax evasion on the books. Employment violations. Your conspiracy with Douglas Hale to frame Nora for theft of a necklace that never left your vault." Victoria's hands began to shake. At 11:44 a.m., the FBI agents walked through the door. Real ones, not Douglas's corrupt friends. They placed handcuffs on Victoria Ashford's wrists while she screamed about lawyers and mistakes and injustice. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records. Phone logs. Confessions extracted through pressure. The federal prosecutors would have their case wrapped up within months. 40 years in prison. Financial ruin. Her family's name transformed from a symbol of Boston society into a cautionary tale about corruption. By 11:59 a.m., both villains were erased from the world that had known them. Douglas disappeared into a warehouse on the outskirts of the city where men worked who specialized in making people regret their choices. Victoria rode in a federal vehicle toward a cell where she would spend decades contemplating the moment she decided a $2,100 salary didn't require human dignity from the person working. Upstairs in Alejandro's penthouse, Nora woke to the sound of the city below. 32 stories of glass between her and the world. She stood at the window and looked out at Boston covered in snow, at the frozen common where she had sat 2 hours ago contemplating the ice, at the streets that had never been kind to her. The door opened behind her. Alejandro stood in the doorway, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. Behind him stood Enzo, and behind Enzo, his daughter Emma in pink pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Vivi," Emma said, using the nickname she'd invented for Nora years ago, back when Nora was still nobody to everyone except this child. "You came back." Nora turned from the window. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not from pain. "Yes," she said. "I came back." And in that moment, standing in a penthouse above a city that had tried to destroy her, surrounded by people who had decided she mattered, Nora Reynolds finally understood what her grandmother's note had always meant. The storm had passed. And she was far stronger than she'd ever known. 3 months and 4 days after the frozen night that changed everything, Nora Reynolds stood in her kitchen at 7:15 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, waiting for water to boil. The apartment was small, a one-bedroom in a neighborhood where the rents were reasonable and the neighbors didn't ask questions, but it was hers. Yellow walls that she had painted herself on a Saturday afternoon in April. White curtains that let the spring light pour in without letting the world outside see her. A refrigerator that actually hummed with food instead of echoing with emptiness. She heard the knock before the kettle whistled. When she opened the door, Alejandro stood there in the hallway, his suit dark gray, his expression carefully neutral. Behind him, Emma wore a pink spring coat and sneakers that were already untied at the laces. The child's eyes went wide. Vivi, Emma whispered, the nickname she'd been using since she was 4 years old. You came back. Nora's breath caught. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words dissolved. Emma didn't wait for them anyway. She launched forward and Nora caught her, all 7-year-old arms and brown curls and the smell of cherry shampoo, and Nora felt something inside her chest that had been frozen for 3 months suddenly thaw into something warm and unbearable. I missed you so much, Emma said into her shoulder. I told Daddy all about you. I told him how you read me stories about the girl who was brave and the boy who was kind and how you said that the scary parts were always the shortest parts because brave people don't stay scared for long. Nora held her tighter. Her hands were shaking. I remember, Nora said. I remember every story I ever read to you. Emma pulled back just enough to look at her face. Why did you go away? I had to, Nora said quietly. But I came back. Alejandro watched from the doorway, his shoulders filling the frame. He didn't move or speak. His eyes moved over the apartment behind her, the yellow walls, the small kitchen table with one chair. He was calculating something, Nora realized. Reading the space like he read every other room he entered. Looking for threats or weaknesses or things that needed correcting. Come in, Nora said, stepping back. Both of you. Emma chattered non-stop as they moved into the apartment. She talked about school and her new friend Sophia who had a dog and her teacher Mr. Patterson who taught them about volcanoes and the science project she was building about the life cycle of butterflies. She talked about her room at the mansion, about the new bookshelf Daddy had added just for her books, about how she still read the stories Nora had taught her to read and sometimes she pretended that Nora was sitting beside her. Nora set her down on the small couch with a blanket and turned on a cartoon, one of the ones Emma had loved years ago. Within 7 minutes, the child was asleep, her head against the cushion, her breathing deep and even. In the kitchen, Alejandro sat at the small table. Nora made coffee in silence. The kettle clicked off. The liquid poured into 2 cups that had cost 99 cents each at a thrift store. She sat across from him. Thank you, she said. For bringing her. Enzo brings her every Saturday, Alejandro said. She asks about you every single time. His voice was steady, controlled. For 3 months and 4 days, she has asked about you. I didn't know, Nora said. I know. He set something on the table between them. A book with worn fabric covers. A notebook. Her grandmother's recipe book. The one she had thought was lost in the Ashford mansion, buried in the boxes of her old life. Enzo retrieved this. 3 weeks ago. Nora picked it up with hands that trembled. She opened to a page at random and found her grandmother's handwriting in blue ink, slanting slightly to the right. A recipe for apple cake with a note in the margin, for hard days, make something sweet. The kitchen is the only place where you control what happens next. I brought her to you because she needed to see that you were alive, Alejandro continued. And I came because I needed to understand something. Nora looked up from the book. 3 months ago, I found you in my poker room covered in blood that wasn't yours, he said. You had a knife in your hand. You were prepared to use it. My men were watching a woman they had never seen before stand in the face of Douglas Hale and refuse to break. He paused. The apartment was so quiet that Nora could hear the distant sound of traffic on the street below, the hum of the refrigerator, her own heartbeat. And my daughter, who barely knows you, who has spent 7 years in the safest possible environment with the most protected possible life, immediately recognized something in you. She called you by a name she invented. She ran toward you. Nora waited. She didn't drink the coffee. She didn't look away. I needed to understand why a man like Douglas Hale would hunt a woman like you, Alindro said. Why he would risk everything, why he would beat you in an alley over money that he claimed you stole. And it took me 3 months to realize the answer. He leaned forward slightly. He was afraid of you. Not your strength. Your refusal to disappear. I'm not special, Nora said quietly. No, Alindro agreed. But you are not nothing either. Not anymore. Not ever again. They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the sun was setting. The sky turned orange and then pink and then the deep blue of early evening. In the living room, Emma slept, her small body curled under the blanket. Tell me about your childhood, Nora said finally. So he did. He told her about his father's fists in a basement in Naples. He told her about hunger that never fully went away no matter how much money he accumulated later. He told her about learning to control every single thing around him because the alternative was chaos and chaos meant pain. He told her about the moment he realized that his empire, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, could not buy back the years he lost to violence. And Nora told him about foster care. 7 different homes. The family that kept her only for the subsidies and then returned her like a broken appliance. The social worker who forgot her name was Maria until the paperwork required it. The way she learned to make herself smaller, quieter, less demanding, because asking for things meant disappointment. At 10:33 p.m., Alindro stood to leave. He had to get Emma home. She had school in the morning. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. If you need anything, he said. I know where to find you, Nora finished, and she was smiling. He almost smiled back. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved like he was remembering how to do it. The door closed. Nora listened to his footsteps disappear down the hallway. She looked at the coffee cups, still full. She picked up her grandmother's recipe book and held it against her chest, and for the first time in her entire life, she felt something that she couldn't quite name. Safety, maybe. Or the beginning of it. The first breath after a long time underwater. 6 months later, at the end of autumn, the city transformed. The shelter where Nora had hidden in darkness was now the place where she changed lives. She had a title now, Director of Youth Programs. She had a salary of $72,000 a year. She had a 2-bedroom apartment with actual furniture, with a second bedroom where Emma stayed some weekends, with walls painted colors that made her happy instead of merely keeping the cold out. The shelter's annual fundraiser gala was held on December 15th, in a ballroom downtown where the ceilings were high and the windows were tall enough to frame the Boston skyline. Snow fell gently outside, the kind of snow that looked like grace when you were safe inside looking out at it. Nora wore a blue dress that she had chosen herself, something simple and elegant, not a uniform and not borrowed. Her hair was down. The scar above her eye had faded almost completely. If you didn't know to look for it, you wouldn't see it at all. She stood on a small stage at 8:53 p.m., looking out at 200 people in formal clothes, people who had donated money and time and resources to keep the shelter running. Donors and board members and local politicians and volunteers who believed in second chances. 5 years ago, I sat in the basement of this shelter, Nora began, and her voice was steady. Clear. The voice of someone who had learned that her words mattered. I was hiding from a man who believed I owed him something I had never taken. I had $34 in my pocket and bruises on my neck and absolutely no belief that my life could become anything other than surviving until tomorrow. But I was wrong about something important. I was wrong about being nobody. She paused. In the back of the room, Alindro stood with his hands in his pockets, watching her like she was the only person who existed. People will tell you that survival means staying small. That protecting yourself means disappearing. That kindness is a weakness that the powerful will exploit. I believed all of those things. I made myself smaller and smaller, thinking that invisible meant safe. But I learned something else entirely when I was given a chance to be brave. Her eyes found Emma in the audience, sitting with Enzo, the child's face bright and focused entirely on Nora. When you protect the innocent with everything you have, when you refuse to break even when breaking seems like the only option, something shifts inside you. You stop being afraid of your own strength. She stepped down from the stage to applause. People wanted to shake her hand, to tell her they had read her story in the local news, to tell her that she was an inspiration. She smiled and accepted their words with grace that hadn't existed 6 months ago. When the crowd finally thinned, Alejandro approached. He wore a dark suit that cost more than her annual salary 3 years ago. His presence was such that people unconsciously stepped out of his path without quite knowing why. "You've done well," he said. "You gave me the chance to," Nora replied. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved over her face like he was memorizing something. "I need to tell you something." Daddy, they have dessert." Emma exploded out of the crowd, grabbing his hand. "There's chocolate cake and there's something with caramel and there's those little pastry things and Enzo said I can have one of each if you say yes." "Can I? Please?" Nora laughed, actually laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her that had been dry for so long. "Come on," she said, taking Emma's other hand. "Let's get you a cookie before your dad says no." Alejandro followed them to the dessert table. He didn't try to say what he had meant to say. There was time for it later, he decided. There was no rush. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, he was learning that the best moments were the ones where nothing was happening except being alive with the people who mattered. Emma chatted about the different flavors of cake. Nora pointed out which cookies had the most chocolate. Alejandro stood slightly behind them, watching, and for just a moment he let himself imagine a future that he had thought was impossible. Yellow walls. Recipe books. A woman who had fought 3 armed men and survived. A child who loved without calculation. A life that wasn't just about power or control or protection, but about something quieter and more precious. The snow continued to fall outside the windows. The city glittered below them. And in that moment, standing with the people who had become his family, Alejandro Bianchi finally understood what his father had stolen from him, and what Nora Reynolds had given back without even knowing she was doing it. The right to simply be alive. They will tell you that people like you don't get happy endings. That the powerful crush the powerless. That survival means staying small and asking for nothing and becoming invisible enough that the world forgets you exist. They are wrong. Nora Reynolds had $34 and bruises that spelled out someone else's violence. She had a grandmother's recipe book and memories of foster care and 7 years as a ghost in someone else's mansion. But she had something they could never take. The refusal to stop fighting. And sometimes, when you protect the innocent with everything you have, the universe sends someone who will protect you with the same ferocity. Not because you are weak, but because you are strong enough to accept that you don't have to do it alone anymore. Your value is not measured by the people who treated you like nothing. It's measured by the children you saved, the second chances you earned, and the strength it took to keep breathing when the ice looked easier than the fight. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember their worth. Like this video if you believe in second chances. Subscribe because tomorrow we have another story about the moment everything changes. Comment below. What would you have done in Nora's place? What kept you fighting when the world tried to convince you to give up? Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. No matter how hard life gets, remember this. The storm will pass. And you are far stronger than you think. We will see you again in the next video. Goodbye.